Because you've had a very interesting career.
For me, it's just, I'm still stunned at how esports has exploded into a huge market.
Fascinating. I didn't know this was a thing.
This is why you kind of need to care about the business side.
It just completely transfers to any business.
I'm excited for what esports are going to do.
Super relevant.
Every year we get record-breaking viewership numbers.
Didn't even know where you could do that.
I still think most of the space is greenfield space. I think that's why you see major companies like Facebook diving into this really aggressively. They recognize there's a tipping point.
How realistic is a future like Ready Player One?
Oh yeah, super realistic.
That story is so relevant, obviously, to our podcast.
I think this is like important for the future of humanity, what's happening here.
Hi there, and welcome to a new episode of Impact Talks. Today we have William Collis with us. He's a startup founder of several startups, among which Genji Analytics and Oxygen Esports. Really excited to have you on. I loved your TED Talk as well as all the other things like your books and stuff like that. But tell the people where they might know you from and what you do.
Yeah. Well, first of all, thanks so much for being here. It's a pleasure to appear on on Impact Talks with you and share a little bit about what I know about esports. I guess for the people listening, they might know me from a couple of different places. One is they might know me from the book that I published, which is the Book of Esports, which is, I think, one of the more popular takes and overviews of the esports industry. Certainly, some people might know me from a podcast I have called The Business of Esports, which is a quite popular podcast tracking sort of the business side and the commercial side of what's going on in competitive gaming. And people actually might know me from, some of the businesses I founded and sold in the space, most notably Genji Analytics and a pro team called OXG. So I've done a bunch of stuff in the space.
One of the things that surprised me was how big the whole thing is. Can you explain kind of from the beginning for somebody who doesn't understand? Is this just still a hobby? Are people still just playing video games, or are these like legit athletes? What is this industry that you're in?
Fundamentally, esports, the way I think about them is they're just competitive video games, right? Well, what really matters is the number of people who take interest in it, the media exposure, the spectators. And so the big thing that's really happened in esports is it's gone from just being competitive gaming, because like way back, when on like the original Nintendo, there were 2-player modes, you could be competitive. I mean, the original Pong, right? You played one-on-one, but we had the competitive piece, but now we have the spectator piece. What's happened is people have wanted to start to watch, and there's been an explosion in terms of viewership, to the point where major esports events like League of Legends, are renting out like Madison Square Garden and selling out the whole thing. And so it's really that combination of competitive games plus spectators that makes esports what it is today and creates an interesting business opportunity and professional opportunity to talk about.
What are some practical businesses that not a Toyota can start, but startups can explore in this space?
Well, there's just tons and tons, because fundamentally gaming is, let's talk back and say, again, I hate to sort of answer your question with like a step back, but think about what gaming is, right? Like if you really think about what video games are, they're probably the most multidisciplinary thing in, honestly, I believe like, maybe the world, right? They combine, skills like programming, which we consider to be a very hard skill, with something like art and graphic design, which we would consider to be very subjective, right? And maybe artistic. They combine that with all sorts of traditional businesses, because the big games companies are public and worth billions of dollars, right? So, that needs finance, that needs brand management, that needs marketing. Now you have a rise of pro teams, because all of these gamers are getting involved in the pro team space. And so that needs player management, talent management, production and, content creation, right? There's whole verticals around that. And so what this means is the opportunities to be involved in gaming and esports are fundamentally pretty limitless, because you could do a business on the coding side that's very hard and data focused. You could do a business on the talent management side that's completely different. You could do an art business. When do I think it's right to begin a business? And I think the answer is 3 things. First of all, it's probably now. Like, I hate to say it, but like the bias should be, if you're trying to decide between now or later, it probably should be now that you're doing this thing. Because the reason is, I think you're better off in a space if you're sooner rather than later, right?
Which parts would you be advising nowadays to enter? Is it maybe starting a physical location where people can get together and do competitive esports, like you're saying Madison Square Garden gets sold out? Where do you see a gap, I guess?
It's a tough question because I still think most of the space is greenfield space, to be honest with you. And the reason for that is I think what's really happening here is games are sort of like the future of humanity. If you think of what's gone on in our life, right? It's been, and this is certainly a story in my lifetime, it's been a story of technology infiltrating and coming closer to the human body. The digitization of technology is connecting us and infiltrating our lives in more ways. And I think games are the ultimate expression of connectivity and digitization today. As the rise of technology becomes more important, games as a whole are going to turn into more and different things, and they're going to become a bigger and bigger share of just how we interact. But at the root of all of esports is something I think many people miss, which is its connectivity, right? Like, I think if you think of games, we have this image of like a solo experience and being locked in your, the stereotypical image of somebody like locked in their room or their basement playing by themselves. But really, no, the trend today in esports, it's founded on competition. And to compete, you have to have people to compete with. It's about bringing people together. And so I generally have a bias, I think, overall in the space towards connectivity-driven businesses, right? Because I think so much of the power of technology is bringing us together. And conversely, so much, or proversely, I don't know that's a word, but that's so much of the power of games too, right? Is how they can bring us together and what relationships and things they can help us forge.
What is your opinion on the other day? I don't know if you saw that. Mark Zuckerberg launched this virtual Oculus conference room situation. Looked like a video game. Did you see that?
Yeah. Yeah, and that's a great example, Lovo, of sort of what I'm talking about. I think there are a lot more tipping point technologies coming. I think VR is an obvious tipping point technology. I think people look at Oculus headsets today and people are wearing them and they look kind of weird, and maybe they're tethered to their computer and they're stumbling around a room and people are like, well, that doesn't look so great. Or yeah, sure, I bet it's fun if you're doing it, but I don't get, but we're just not at the tipping point yet, but I believe we're very, very close. And I think that's why you see major companies like Facebook diving into this really aggressively, because they recognize there's a tipping point here. Fundamentally, gamers for VR were just the early adopters, right? But now we're going to see that gaming-like universe extended to connectivity. Meetings, I think, is the example, is first one here, but it's going to go everywhere.
I think you started this like 6-7 years ago. Can't imagine it was like super popular back then.
Yeah, I think we were one of the earlier esports startups to get a bunch of venture funding, actually, which is pretty crazy. How you raise capital is a totally different story and probably a podcast in itself, because raising capital is very, very, very difficult. The two hardest phases in building a company are right at the beginning. It's raising capital and it's acquiring your early users. Those are the two hardest parts, and they come right at the beginning, which is why I think so many startups don't make it out of the seed stage. They fail because they have to do their hardest hurdles earliest. So how we raise money, and this is going to give some general advice to people now, about how you raise venture capital. So first of all, like I said, make sure you have the team in place to raise. So, again, I think it's very hard to get given money as a one-person show. It's far more credible to get money when you have the team. So going back to my checklist of 3 things, to do a startup, right? Now, seriousness and team, make sure the team is there. You have to make sure the team is there. And if it's not, don't even try to go get money right now, because your odds of success aren't that great. Go look around, find it. So make sure you have your team in place. Venture is a game of long, slow effort. I don't think there's any other way to describe it, right? At least particularly for people who are raising for your first startup. It gets a lot easier with subsequent startups, but your first startup is hard to do because you don't have any track record of building startups. So convincing somebody to give you a lot of money is really difficult. And so the way you do it is twofold. One is you just talk to everyone. You follow up every connection. I think I was pretty introverted for most of my life, and raising money turned me into an extrovert. I know that's crazy to say, but like it literally forced me to get comfortable inserting myself into conversations, bringing things up, pushing myself, promoting myself, right? Because otherwise you don't get enough connections. And then, so you start, and there's the great thing about VC today is there's all these ways to get in touch with VC funds, right? They have idea submission competitions, right? They have contact information on a website. They'll do pitch days and other things. There are incubators that you can go through. So you're driving all of these angles, right? You're trying to literally do everything that you can do to get in front of venture capitalists. Once you're in front of the venture capitalists, I think a secret I have and a recommendation I have is never leave the conversation with a venture capitalist empty-handed. And by that, I mean, it doesn't matter if they're probably not going to invest. Let's be realistic. That's why I have to have these conversations. So ask any venture capitalist you talk to at the end to introduce you and your company to 2 other people that they know. Turn that one connection into 2 connections. And that actually adds a lot of value for 2 reasons. One is now you've doubled the number of people you know in the space. You've turned what was potentially a dead end because that person doesn't invest into 2 new leads that you can follow up. That's the first. But the second is, and I think venture investors like to get the opinions of their friends. They like to, and particularly if they're going to invest in a company and they're maybe even considering you more seriously than you realize, they like to know what other people in the industry might think. They like to, it's very rare that a round is done by itself. There's a lead and then other people follow. And typically investors who lead your round like to invite other investors that they know into the round. So it also makes it easier for the person you're talking to invest because it gets you in front of people they might know, he or she might know, right? To have a dialogue and, further vet your idea. So I really like that as a recommendation. And the last thing you do is you create urgency. Why should a venture capitalist give you money now? Right? Like, why should they give you money now? Because they will get more information if they wait. It's true, right? They will absolutely get more information if they wait. They'll learn more about the market. You'll do more work on the product, right? Like, it's just better for them to wait. The incentives for VCs are to wait. So for them to invest in you, for that to be worth it, they need a reason why the investment has to be now. Life cycle, right? At a certain point, the challenge becomes scale and scalability. And particularly for B2C consumers, this is, I think, the 3rd hardest part. I said the first hardest part is raising money, then getting your early users. The next hardest part is getting across these scale inflection curves, right? Like getting a business to really, blast past every milestone and have 1 trillion users, right? Fundamentally, this business was coming from the same insight as everything I've done, which is I love games. And I can start to see what the world looks like when games are more serious and taken more seriously. And I just pick the pieces of that world that I think are really interesting and try to go and make them.
What are some closing thoughts or some things that you didn't share yet that you'd like to share with our audience?
Oh, man. I mean, that's a really good question. First closing thought I would say is take esports very, very seriously. Take a look at it and what's actually going on in the space, because if you're a parent, it's going to matter because it's what your kids are doing. If you're a business leader, it's going to matter because it's a demographic for you to access and it's an important market trend. If you're as we talked about, even if you're a college professor, you might get asked to teach a course. So this is something going on in the world that you should probably know about, and you shouldn't have, I'm not saying you need to become an expert, but you should have familiarity with it. And more importantly, you shouldn't dismiss it as silly kids playing online. It really is an important moment in how people interact, and it's really changing how people connect. It's the birth of true digital competition. My advice, think about it. Think about the 3 steps I said about, being ready to start a company. Think about, in particular, the importance of the co-founders and that great co-founding team. Think about how hard the different steps are, and know that if the beginning feels really difficult in the business, it's okay. It's because it is the hardest part, and think more about, how the good ways that technology can bring us together, because I really do think that's one of the big forces that it has in our lives. And I hope that's the direction it takes.
Thank you so much for being on, and hope to see you soon. If you like this episode, you can check out our most recent one here. And if you haven't already, make sure you click here to subscribe and see the next one. But if you're interested in more tips and tricks, then make sure to join our Facebook group, where you can find thousands of like-minded people and you get direct access and support to any business questions